Welcome. I'm Matt Leininger. I'm the director of the Center for Democracy Innovation at the National Civic League. Welcome to our August Promising Practices webinar on Citizen Assemblies 101. As you're joining us, feel free to put your name in your organization or your community in the chat so we can get a sense of like who's here. Please also mute yourself so we don't hear various children, dogs, other sorts of background noises in your world. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be sending the recording, and including the chat recording, and all kinds of other resources to you at the end of the session today. So a little bit about the Civic League. The National Civic League has a mission to advance civic engagement to create equitable, thriving communities. We were founded in 1894 by a group led by Teddy Roosevelt, Louis Brandeis, Mary Mumford, and other leaders, civic leaders of the day. So it's one of America's oldest good governance organizations. The League championed many of the democracy innovations of that early 20th century, of that period of time, and we're in fact in the thick of that same sort of question now. How do we kind of plug democracy innovations into our systems to make them work better? Some of the things we do, in addition to hosting webinars, we maintain the Model City Charter, which we've updated periodically since 1902. We organize the All-America City Awards. We'll say a bit more about that in a minute. We publish the National Civic Review, and we support this large national network of local civic leaders, including elected officials, appointed leaders, all kinds of people who we learn with and learn from. The center that I run works with public officials to understand, test, and disseminate the next generation of civic innovations, which have the potential to make democracy more participatory, equitable, and productive. One of these innovations is the subject of the webinar today. Before we get into that, let me say a little bit about the All-America City Award, which is our flagship event every year. It was started in 1949, so we've now got 75 years of awarding the All-America City Awards. Earlier this year, this summer, in June, we had announced the 2024 recipients. And next week, we are actually going to be launching the 2025 application, which will have the theme of strengthening environmental sustainability through inclusive community engagement. So you've got some dates here that are important. If you're considering being part of an application, you can certainly reach out to us for all kinds of information about how to do that, how to apply, what the process is like, what the event is like. It is a terrific event. It's a very inspiring and educational thing. I urge you all to consider it. So what we use, Rebecca Trout, by the way, who's on this call, is the person who has all of the information about AAC to give you all kinds of guidance about how to apply. So we use AAC in part to celebrate local civic engagement accomplishments. We also are using these webinars to kind of share some of the promising practices we know about, either from AAC winning communities or other examples, other people that we have met, like the ones we are working with here at today's webinar, and other sorts of projects and tools that could be helpful to your work. So again, key details here. Keep in mind we're recording everything, including the chat. Slides and recording will be emailed to you later today or maybe tomorrow. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. It's going to be a large group of people, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat whenever you'd like, and we'll maybe deal with some of them as we go. Others we will perhaps either combine. I'll try to combine some of them, or we'll potentially ask you to unmute yourself and ask them verbally at the end of the session. So today we're talking about a democracy innovation that offers an opportunity for meaningful citizen engagement. And I'm excited by citizen assemblies because they can be this kind of high-profile, leading-edge demonstration of what diverse groups of ordinary citizens can do, how they can learn together, understand each other, make decisions together, even on really tough issues. When you surround assemblies with other kinds of engagement, which allow larger numbers of people than that even to be aware of the assembly, to contribute ideas to it or questions, to maybe answer surveys from assembly members and so on. When you build the assemblies and other sorts of engagement together in ways where they complement one another, and you build them into a way that our communities and political processes work, you get a formula which I think can improve public decisions dramatically and help get past legislative gridlock, improve how democracy works overall. And as we're going to hear about on this call, like many other democracy innovations, the people who participate in assemblies like them and they find them meaningful and gratifying. And that's an important thing to be thinking about with any sort of change that you're proposing to the way that your communities work. So today's speakers are all knowledgeable about citizen assemblies, either as practitioners, as researchers, as advocates, or all of the above, and their experience with them in very in various parts of the world. I'll just briefly introduce the three of them right now, and you're going to hear from them in turn. So we have Marjan Assasi, who is the executive director of the Federation for Innovation and Democracy North America. And her book has just come out. It's called Activated Citizenship, The Transformative Power of Citizen Assemblies. So please, hot off the presses, check that out. Marjan's also a Berggruen Institute Future of Democracy Fellow. She's a senior fellow with the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability at Ohio State, senior associate at Mass LVP, and strategic program director of the Democratic Action Fund. Brandon Keating is the founder and CEO of Unify, Younify, and she has a 20-year history of scaling relationship-based community building for social change. She's trained organizations, individuals all over the U.S. She's a civic engagement innovator. She's overseen over 24 randomized controlled experiments conducted with social scientists, including first of their kind studies on the most effective ways to reduce polarization and change voter behavior. She's also a winner of the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, and she served in leadership roles on both of President Obama's campaigns. Jillian Youngblood is the executive director of Civic Genius. She's worked at every level of government. She's worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer there. She managed New York City's federal and state legislative portfolios on public health in the Bloomberg administration and in the New York State Senate. She's also been a strategic communications consultant and advised on innovative constituent engagement processes. And she and Brandon are in the midst of supporting a citizen assembly that they're going to tell you about in Millcreek, Utah. So I think with all of that, a quick plug here. If after hearing from today's speakers, you'd still like to learn more about the Citizen Assemblies, please do join us. We're going to be having a fall school on Citizen Assemblies that FIDE North America and the Civic League are in the process of putting together. It's going to be in October. There's the dates right there. Through interactive sessions, including with people, all of us here on the call, you'll be talking to people and kind of acquiring more skills and knowledge that will help you design and implement impactful deliberative processes. So we're going to include some details about that in our follow-up email. We're trying to also, in addition to the school itself, organize an introductory workshop, which will be on the 22nd, which will focus on a whole range of democracy innovations, including citizen assemblies, and then that will lead into the school conceptually and chronologically. So before we go ahead with Marjan, let's do a quick poll to get a sense of people's familiarity with citizen assemblies. Rebecca's going to put the poll up on the screen now, and you basically have 4 questions about your level of knowledge about citizen assemblies. I don't have a clue. I know a little bit. I'm pretty knowledgeable, or I could give this webinar myself. So this is good. A lot of people are in the know a little bit category, which is probably the perfect territory for today. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for your time and for the questions. Marjan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. Hi, everybody. I'm going to try and change the slide here. Share my slide deck right there. Okay. Here, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Let's go back to the beginning. So it is an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you and to present on Citizens Assemblies with partners like NCL, Civic Genius, and Unify. I'm really looking forward to this conversation together. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of citizens assemblies in general. Matt has laid out for us a little bit sort of the reasons why democratic innovations, and especially as they relate to citizens assemblies or citizen engagement rather, are really important. So what I would ask you to do is, as I kind of take you through my slide deck, to think a little bit about whether, how I guess you would describe your ways of engaging with your communities, whether it's by way of your town halls, your community engagement meetings. Do you consider them to be inclusive? Are they responsive to the needs of your community members? Are you informing your citizens in those processes? Do you find that they're impactful? Are they innovative in any particular way? Or are they fun? So as you're thinking about this, Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So as I was, and Matt mentioned sort of a little bit about my background, but I spent about 15 years working on citizen participation programs all over the world with organizations like the World Bank, the National Democratic Institute, the American Bar Association. And I was feeling a little bit frustrated about the fact that the way that we are engaging with our communities, whether it was at local level or the national level, was not very innovative. So in my in search of meaningful citizen engagement and consequential voice, I discovered Citizens Assemblies. And I often say that my aha moment was really Citizens Assemblies, and I describe it as my Daryl Morey moment. And for those of you who are basketball fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But for those of you who don't know, Daryl Morey, when he was the general manager of the Houston Rockets from 2007 to 2020, is one of the people who is attributed with kind of revolutionizing the way that the NBA functions and creating this kind of huge culture around the three-point shots. So that was my sort of Citizens Assemblies were my Daryl Morey moment.
But James Harden will not be joining this webinar. Just
sorry.
James Harden will not be joining this webinar.
So before I move forward a little bit, I just wanted to give you a sense for sort of this, what the OECD calls the deliberative wave. So over the past 10, 15 years, as you can see on this chart, the number of citizens' assemblies have truly exploded, mainly outside of the US, some in Canada, mainly in Western Europe again, but other parts of the world as well, especially the global South. We're seeing more and more citizens' assemblies. The chart that I'm sharing with you here is from their 2021 report. So it kind of lacks the data from the last 2-3 years, which they've been compiling, and shows an even greater explosion. And I think the changes that we're seeing over the past 2-3 years are especially as elsewhere in the world, citizens' assemblies are becoming kind of moving away from being one-offs to becoming more permanent and institutionalized, both in cities such as Paris, which has a citizens' assembly for the city of Paris, or also at the national level. We see this with the German Bundestag, for instance, the German parliament, which now has a citizens' assembly baked into its structure. Here, I just wanted to give you a sense for the few citizens' assemblies that I have been privileged to be a part of over the past 5 years. And I show you this more because I just want you to pay attention to maybe the issues that were covered. Some of these are national, some of these are local, but as you can see, we've had citizens' assemblies on climate, we have them on homelessness, we've had them on democratic expression. The one in Petaluma was on land use, on the end of life and the changes in law around euthanasia and assisted suicide, on political campaign financing, which was a national level one, and then also on sort of tackling hatred in society. So there are many different ways and many different issues that a citizens' assembly can tackle. So what is a citizens' assembly? When we talk about sort of citizens' assembly, what we're really talking about at the higher level is how can we find ways, and we say this at FIDA in North America, to put the public back in public policy. And some of the characteristics that the chart that you see on the left is from the OECD report, but I generally like to talk about it in terms of 4 essential characteristics. The very first one is a government body has a problem, a public problem in need of solution. And in need of solution, meaning you are seeking input from your residents. That, again, can be at the local level, it could be at the national level, but typically that public problem, we will pose a question and invite citizens to come and provide and draft proposals around that problem. And again, we can talk about in the Q&A about the different issues that can be addressed in this way. But generally, as I showed you before, there are many different issues that can be the subject of a citizens' assembly. But the fact that it's commissioned by a government body at the local level or the national level is really important from beginning to end. And we'll talk about that. And then we use sortition. So we use democratic lottery to make sure that we have a representative group of citizens and that we include the most marginalized voices at the table. And I'll talk a little bit more about democratic lottery in a moment. The third piece, and this is really, really important, there are always 3 phases to a citizens' assembly. And I also want to say, sort of as I'm talking about this, I know that sometimes when I talk to cities, cities can become overwhelmed by all of these requirements. And I always like to say, this is the way a citizens assembly is. So we're trying in this session, we're defining what an assembly is. But any city at any level can take some of the ingredients from what a citizens assembly is and create your own community engagement methods. You don't have to have all of this. We just kind of recommend that all of this then equates a citizens assembly. So the first phase is always learning, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Honestly, this is one of the things that really drew me to citizens assemblies, because at a time of pervasive polarization, I felt like being able to, before we debate around policies, being able to have a phase where people come together and they truly learn about the issue in a way that's balanced and diverse is truly important. So that's the learning phase. And typically it makes up 1/3 of your citizens assembly. Whether your citizens assembly is over 6 sessions or 9 sessions, 1/3 of it is dedicated to learning. The second phase is deliberation, and this is generally facilitated deliberation. And we do this in plenary sessions. So all of your members will be deliberating together or in smaller group sessions. And as part of the deliberation, the citizens will start then drafting proposals and recommendations, which then feeds into the third phase, which is the production of the final report. And we could spend an hour just talking about how that should be done, whether there should be a limited number of proposals or not. But at the end of a citizens assembly, we have a final report, which is then number 4, then submitted to that government body. That very first government body that mandated the citizens assembly doesn't always, but should present itself, should accept the final report. And at that point, there should also be very clear kind of feedback loops. So within 6 to 9 months, that government body will then make a commitment to come back to the citizens and explain what has been and what hasn't been adopted, or what they plan to adopt and what they don't. So let's spend a little bit more time talking about who's in the room, because this is a process that not everyone is very familiar with. The very first phase, so generally we say a democratic lottery has 2 phases. The first phase is when you send random emails. Sometimes it's done by text, depending on the context. We have done calls in France, for instance, they do calls. But generally, I would say the predominant way of doing this is by sending mailers. The very first phase is you send out mailers to a random body of residents, anywhere from 5 to 10. I've seen 12, 14,000 people. It is a voluntary position. So what we're asking them in that mailer, and it's important for the mandating body to have its signature on that letter so that it makes it official, is that there's a question around that issue, what you're asking your citizens to come and respond to, and you have the list of sessions so they know how many sessions they're committing to. And there's a date by which they need to respond and say that they are willing and able to volunteer. Once we receive those, and again, each of these pieces is very kind of sophisticated in itself, but we typically, depending on the context, in countries where citizens assemblies are not very familiar, we generally get anywhere between 3 to 5% response rates. In countries like Germany, where it's becoming a lot more familiar, they sometimes get between 18 and 20% response rate. So depending on the pool of responses that you get, we sometimes have 800, 1400. We then sit down and we have criteria. So of course, some are very important. Gender is always important. Age is often important. Race, ethnicity, income levels, city versus rural. We put together anywhere between 5 to 7 criteria that's really important to that citizens assembly. And then we have statisticians, or there are now also programs that we can use that will then put together a number of panels, and we choose one of those panels. And then we have a selection event where we create the panel. And of course, we notify then all of the members that are accepted, and then we onboard them. So that is really the democratic lottery. And I will say, as someone, as I mentioned, who has been involved with citizen participation for 15, 17 years, I have never seen as representative a sampling of people present for a citizens assembly as I have seen in any other citizen participation program that we have. And then what happens in the room? So as I mentioned, the first phase is about the learning phase. And here there are different ways of doing this. We often recommend that there is a committee that is set up for the curation of the evidence to make sure that it's impartial, to make sure that it's balanced. And this involves kind of the material that you present to your panel members, and we often will not send materials to them beforehand because we also want to meet everyone at the same place, and we know that there are citizens who will read this stuff, you know, and read every word before they arrive, and then there are those who won't. So we often have the briefing books ready for them when they first arrive. And then it's also a question of experts and who makes up the experts. Experts are generally either issue experts, they're advocates and stakeholders, or we also try and get people who have lived experience. So, you know, if you're talking about homelessness, you want to make sure that you have presenters who can speak to different parts of the homelessness experience. And then after that learning phase, and you know, there are lots of different guidelines that we have, but we also want to make sure that participants are also able to request additional speakers. And we often see that there isn't enough time made for this, but it is an important piece of this as well. And then they deliberate. And again, as I said, they deliberate in plenary session, they deliberate in smaller sessions. And it's really, really important, of course, to have really good deliberative facilitation to make sure that everyone feels comfortable at the voices at the tables and everyone is heard, which is very challenging. And then the third phase is the policy recommendations. And this is where we do sometimes use voting to make sure that we streamline the number of recommendations. I have seen reports that, you know, have recommendations that are not very actionable, and it makes it very difficult for government officials to then know what to do with those recommendations. So we want to make sure, to the extent that we can, and often we don't have enough time to do all of this really well, but we want to make sure that the policy recommendations are really well reasoned, really well thought out, really well substantiated, and actionable. And then finally, the feedback loop, which is really important. You want to make sure, and this is something that you want to make sure with government from the beginning, that there are feedback loops, that this is an area where your government mandating body is willing to change policy. What an assembly is not, and I always find it's important to say this, because in the work that we do, an assembly, a citizens assembly, is not meant to replace our representative democracies. Our intention is really to create these layers of citizens assemblies to bring residents into the public policy cycle. It is not to replace, it is in fact to complement and to strengthen relationships between our residents and the state at a time where, you know, numbers suggest that there's very little trust, there's very little confidence in political institutions. And they are also not town halls, focus groups, or public policy or public pollings. As I discussed, this is a place, it's a forum where the learning phase is really important to us. So we want to make sure that citizens are learning together, that they're deliberating together, and all of this allows for the emergence of collective intelligence and informed and considered judgment. So just a moment, and I don't want to take too much time, I'm very conscious of the time, just to talk a little bit about the impact, because this is really important. And I find it especially important because when I work with different groups and cities, I often, one of my first questions is, what problem are you trying to solve with a citizens assembly? And so speaking through some of the impacts of citizens assemblies is important if it kind of helps highlight maybe some of the areas that you find your citizen engagement is lacking. So one of the very first ones, of course, is diversity. As I mentioned, the democratic lottery system that we use, the sortition-based system that we use, allows for inclusion, allows for diversity. And I also didn't mention, but it's not just about getting people to say yes to be in the room, it's also making sure to support them when they're in the room. And that means really having measures that allow for the coverage of childcare and transportation and translation and all of those things that will make it possible for people to stay engaged with an assembly. The second piece is learning, and I think I've talked about this enough, but you know, the importance of an informed citizenry sometimes I think is lost on us these days, and citizens assemblies really truly allow citizens to learn about those issues. And there's a lot of research that suggests that they change their opinion either completely on an issue, or we see nuanced changes in their positions as a result of the learning. And then policies reflect citizens' preferences. I mean, we can go on and on this call, and we won't do this, but around, policies in the United States where the majority seems to be in favor of certain things, but those preferences are really not reflected in policy. And so citizens' assemblies allow for that to emerge. Social cohesion, this is a really, really important piece, especially when we talk about the epidemic of loneliness in the United States. Social cohesion, the sense of belonging that bubbles up, the sense of community, and that has been one of the most astounding parts of my research, and it's really a focus of my book as well, is groups that come together that have not ever sat together. They sit with people from different neighborhoods, and those relationships continue. We start setting up alum associations, groups, and they continue being involved together. In fact, many of them continue advocating for citizens' assemblies after their work is done with the assembly. And then, of course, and this is an important piece, the transparency piece. Oh, and I see a typo there, and I'm sorry about that. The legitimacy piece and accountability, which, of course, all of it ends up not only, and this is a piece that I'll just mention, to me, it's really important the way that not only are citizens, is their trust in their political institution and their government enhanced, but their trust in themselves. We see far, far more trust in their place in their democracy and their ability to impact change, which is really important. And this is the last piece, which is strengthening of civic muscle. My book is really focused on the impact of citizens' assemblies on the individual participants. And one of the really important pieces for me has always been in my research, that sense of voice and the inadequacy of right now platforms, I think, in most of our democracies around really having a place for your meaningful voice, and citizens' assemblies are a great place for that. And then finally, just a couple other things. I just wanted to make sure that, as we talk about sort of North America, we don't forget that even though we don't see many citizens' assemblies as of today, I mean, there are happening now, and we're excited to hear from Jillian and from Brandon about the work that they're doing. And there are several other citizens' assemblies that are also happening in the United States, that while they're not as prevalent as we see them in Western Europe, that they really started. The ideas around sortition-based citizens' juries started in the United States in the 1970s with Ned Crosby's work, and I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge that. I'm going to pass over the Petaluma case study because we're going to have a case study, but I did want to just mention that there is a case study, if you're interested in one, from the United States that's on the Berggruen website, and we're going to share that with you after this. Again, just quickly, just to mention that there are, this Pew research was done in 2021. I personally was really surprised to see the numbers because I wasn't even sure that many people knew about citizens' assemblies, but 79% of Americans responded that they thought it was really important to have citizens' assemblies where citizens could debate and make recommendations around national laws, which I thought was quite something. And then over the past year, given the fact that it seems like there is growing interest around citizens' assemblies, we have launched FIDE North America, which is the Federation for Innovation and Democracy. And there is FIDE Europe, has existed for the past 3-4 years, and they've done an exceptionally great job in Europe. And we are building on that great work. Some of our offerings are a little bit different, but just to give you a quick kind of summary of what we do, we focus a lot on awareness raising, whether it's through presentations or programs, such as the Global Innovations in Democracy that I partner with Matt on as well, and our capacity building schools, which Matt mentioned. So those are really important to us because we need better practitioners across this country. We have some great ones, and we need to build that body. The second part of what we do is it is really important for FIDE in North America in the next couple of years to make sure that we have amazing proofs of concept so that this can become we can accelerate the number of citizens' assemblies across the United States. So two of the things that we do within that context is, one, we provide technical guidance either on an advisory board or on an oversight committee, or even just in terms of strategic advisors. to every Citizens Assembly that's going to happen in North America. And we're really excited about playing that role and being able to do that with Citizens Assemblies so that we make sure that they're designed for legitimacy and change and real impact. And then the other piece of that is we're also doing independent evaluations of assemblies. This is something that that while I was doing my research in Europe for my book, I realized that there were very few research teams that were doing the same kind of research across Citizens Assembly, which then would allow them to have some comparative data. So FIDA North America is trying to fill that hole here in the US as we begin sort of seeing more and more assemblies, and Europe is actually going to be doing this as well, which is quite exciting. And then finally, we do share and partner with other organizations to build this field and to make it stronger. And then just quickly, I think that I'm at time, so I don't want to go on any longer, but this is the first Citizens Assembly school that we had in April. And all the speakers were with us, which was wonderful. And actually, there are a couple of Citizens Assemblies that have come out of that. And then we have our next one, which Matt mentioned. So please make sure if you're interested to sign up. And I think that in the fall, NCL will have another seminar specifically on the book, which I'll be excited to sort of present to you as well. And then other than that, I'm just happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjan. Let's move on to Jillian and Brandon, who will be talking about a Citizens Assembly, which is taking place pretty much as we speak in America, in Millcreek, Utah.
As we Great to be here with everybody today. I will, is everyone seeing slides? Terrific. Oh, Brandon, you're on mute.
Rookie mistake. All right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Marjan. As Marjan shared, a citizen assembly is not a town hall or a focus group or a public meeting. But for folks new to citizen assemblies, a lot of the same hopes and fears can apply. So we'd love to actually kick off this section. And by the way, seeing so many great questions in the chat, really excited to answer those. We want to kick off this section by hearing something from you, which is based on your own experience or imagination of town halls or other public meetings, and based on all that Marjan shared. What are your biggest hopes and fears about citizen assemblies right now? We'd love for you to just type into the chat anything that you think is a potential concern or pitfall or horrifying fear, and anything that you think is a really hopeful opportunity related to citizen assemblies. So just want to give folks a minute to do that. Awesome. Mindy says inclusivity at the table. Yeah, both a challenge and an opportunity. Lance says the most engaged and the most resourced citizens dominate the discourse and decision making. Definitely have a lot of steps in our process to solve for that. So glad that you're thinking about that. And Marianne says disruptive participants. Yeah, that can be a challenge. And again, lots of structural elements that we have built in the process to deal with that. And staffing issues, time, concern, and opportunity. Alexis says use of science in the learning portion, opening it up to local knowledge. Jennifer says being productive, focusing on discourse back to the residents. Whether it might be a soapbox opportunity that could create further decisions. Keith is concerned about hijacking by a single personality. And John is concerned about getting blue collar folks and the required reading, briefing, and culture of deliberation, whether that could come off as pro-intellectual and anti-populist. Awesome. Please, episodic funding is also a challenge for sure. So I think we're going to hit a little bit on all of these, and thanks so much for sharing those. And we'll be excited to dig in more both in the Q&A and after the session.
Yes, lots of really good thoughts and a lot of really familiar things that we've dealt with in a lot of different contexts and addressed in a lot of different contexts and are bringing to the project that we are doing in partnership with the city of Millcreek in Utah. So in this section, we'll address some of those hopes and fears that folks brought up, and we'll also address some of the key framing questions for this session through the lens of our work on the ground. Specifically, I mean the potential of citizen assemblies to alleviate political polarization and enhance civic engagement, not just among the folks who are already engaged, but more broadly, which I know a few people alluded to in the chat. How citizen assemblies can serve the purpose of providing innovative solutions to really complex policy issues and the processes for selecting participants, providing expert consultations, and facilitating productive discussions and deliberations. So really everything that's been coming up in the chat. First, let me offer a little bit of context. So Brandon and I both have extensive experience designing deliberative processes, both inside and outside of government. Based on that experience and our study of global best practices, Civic Genius and Unify have co-created a customizable assembly design that balances both fidelity to those global best practices and innovation and adaptation to the US context. And that includes customization specific to each locality, knowing that the dynamics are different absolutely everywhere.
Our initial goal is to identify 6 pilot locations as an outgrowth of our own existing on-the-ground grassroots and grass tops membership, as well as other relationships through which we get requests for support. Right now, we have Millcreek, Utah in progress and several other communities in the pipeline, but today we'll be just focusing in on the Millcreek, Utah example.
So Marjan walked through some of the key elements that you see in a citizen assembly, and we just want to hit on those so that we can dig into them in terms of the specific example in Utah. So across all assemblies, there are some key elements that will be holding constant. So in each assembly, we are partnered with government. A minimum criterion for us is that government agrees to consider and publicly respond to the Assembly's recommendations. That is a minimum. We're also investing deeply in sortition and ensuring that we have a truly representative sample of the community. And I know there's some good questions, and we can dig into that a little bit more in the Q&A. And of course, each assembly will include the 3 phases of learning, deliberation, and making recommendations.
Each assembly for us also includes rigorous measurement. We are working with academics who are affiliated with the Harvard Human Flourishing Program to conduct both quantitative measurement and culturally relevant qualitative measurement focused on the impact of the assembly on the broader community. Additionally, we're a part of FIDE's learning community, which brings measurement on the impact of the participants themselves. Critically, these assemblies are part of a long-term offline and online arc of engagement and are meant to be institutionalized annually. Creating a fun, accessible process and modeling healthy partnerships are also key elements of how we approach the implementation of the citizens assemblies.
So we began partnering with local government in Millcreek in January as an outgrowth of our work with our pre-existing local membership. And we've also been meeting regularly with the mayor and the city council to customize that design. We also co-developed a list of potential issues for the assembly to focus on with the mayor and the city council, and we continue to meet with them regularly.
In June, we soft launched our digital citizen input process for issue selection with the chatbot and targeted digital ads, and we received over 400 responses to that initial soft launch. We've paused that process to complete our baseline pre-surveys. Once those pre-surveys are complete, local outreach fellows embedded in our organization, city staff, and community partners will fully launch the online and offline process, socializing the assembly, getting further input, and creating a robust feedback loop with the broader community. So this outreach will include door knocking, phone calling, community events, and 2 more chatbot deployments to ensure that we're fully socializing the assembly with the entire community. So this speaks to some of the questions about how do we make sure this is a relevant process to all segments of the community.
So we plan to run an online and offline process for holding the assembly meetings. That includes 10 sessions, 2 community forums, and 2 relational gatherings for the assembly members so that they can start building some of that civic or social cohesion and civic infrastructure that Marjan talked about. The assembly meetings will alternate between Zoom and in person. That's an effort to make this as accessible to people as possible in their very, very busy and crowded lives. Our target for completion is mid-2025.
So this shining face that you see on the left of your screen is Mayor Silvestrini. And when we first started chatting with him about the potential of a citizen assembly in Millcreek, one thing that he got super excited about, which might also excite many of you, is the potential of citizen assemblies to both reduce toxic polarization and help the city productively engage people they don't yet hear from very often. I saw a lot of commentary and question bubbling up about those 2 pieces in the chat. So we're delighted to talk more about how those are working in the Q&A.
Yeah, so as I said, to co-design this model, we drew from global best practices and from lessons learned and leveraged our own organizational strengths in doing deliberative work. Our model, I just want to emphasize, is fully customizable to cities, to counties, to states. The key ingredients always include behavioral science-based interventions, accessibility in terms of language, culture, all of the many things that can mean accessibility. Not just can you get there? And they're fun and they're culturally relevant. At least I think they're fun.
And so to the question in the chat about, how do we make sure that the materials are relevant to different communities, we put a lot of thought into that cultural relevance piece. That's what we're talking about with the cultural relevance and fun. And as I mentioned earlier, these are an outgrowth of our year-round civic engagement program. So they're not isolated. And within that program, connected to the assembly, we build real skills among residents, both participants and non-participants, for coming together to solve problems. And we also build buy-in for participation in public processes from people who aren't the usual suspects to come together with those who are.
We love the usual suspects and want to make sure that everybody else is there with them. So as Marjan shared, participants learn from subject matter experts. Because our process builds participation beyond the usual suspects and is facilitated to draw on solutions that marry policy expertise with lived experience, innovative solutions become more commonplace.
And critically, because of the stakeholder buy-in process, implementation is both incentivized and runs more smoothly. I want to note also that skillful issue selection is really important for setting the process up for success. The issue does need to be sufficiently narrow and within the purview of the relevant decision-making body for implementation to run smoothly.
Participant selection, I just want to spend a minute on, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but participant selection can really make or break a citizen assembly. And for us, that begins not just in the process of mailing, of sending out those 10,000 or so letters, but in the process of socializing the citizen assembly in the community, which carries through to the feedback loop created with the broader community and engagement of the community in every element of the process.
And I saw a lot in the chat about how these can sort of survive the vicissitudes of government processes and transitions. Is it better for them to be inside or outside of government? We actually think the strongest assemblies are executed as a partnership between government and external nonprofit organizations. And our opinion on that actually comes from research. In 2001, Unified's board chair, John Kessler, who was then ED of the U.S. Healthy Cities and Communities Coalition, designed and conducted a study in partnership with the National Civic League that was published in the winter 2001 issue of the National Civic Review. And what that study sought to do was to identify high-performing communities of different sizes, high-performing in terms of civic and political health. And they found 5. The through line among those communities that were high performing was that each community had an had independently developed a neutral convener that would work with the community to identify a key policy issue of concern to the community through robust engagement, and then bring experts and community members together and facilitate a decision-making process, which sounds like a lot like a citizen assembly, right? And so they built on that research to find an additional 7 communities. And that work is also described in a chapter of a book edited by John Gastiel and Peter Levine, which came out in 2005. And so we are delighted to partner with you to help customize a citizen assembly for your community and help strike that inside outside of government balance in a way that really honors the unique attributes of the community and engages folks across all different demographics.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got lots of questions, some of which may be partially answered in the comment in the chat and many not. And first, I think there's a whole raft of them that have to do with accountability. You know, some people asking, well, okay, why at the end of the process, what compels officials to go by or at least seriously consider the recommendations or ideas that come out of an assembly? Others asking, well, wait a minute, to what extent is the assembly accountable to the officials? Do the officials kind of too bound by them? So there's that whole question. I'd love you guys to comment on. And then some specific aspects of that, people asking, okay, well, what is the role of elected officials in the assembly sessions themselves? Do they participate? Not? Are they at the beginning, at the end? And then also questions related to the media, which is another kind of potential form of a force for accountability of lots of people in the community know about this and know about the recommendation. So maybe starting with you, Marjan, and then Jillian and Brandon.
Sure, happy to. Thanks for that, Matt, and thank you for summarizing, and thank you to Nick for responding to a lot of the questions in the chat. So in terms of sort of accountability, in my experience, at least over the past 5 years, what I have seen is very important, and I would say is one of the key ingredients of your success at the end of the process, is making sure that you have your government partner on board from the very beginning. Because what often happens, not always, because we've had citizens assemblies where government is kind of unsure, but at the end, there's so much excitement, so much energy that they want to adopt those policy changes. That happens. But oftentimes what I say to implementers and practitioners is make sure that you get your buy-in at the beginning. The most successful marriage of a citizens assembly, in my view, is when you have government willing to move the needle on something and you have citizens excited about that issue as well. So making sure that you invest enough time to meet with the right agencies. And this is one of the things that we didn't talk about, but I often say, setting up a governance structure, a governance committee to oversee the Citizens Assembly is a really good idea for a number of different things. It's good for legitimacy, for transparency, but it's also really good because it allows you to bring the stakeholders, government bodies and non-government bodies, together in a committee that will then help direct and also help you with buy-in. So that's one piece. I think in terms of the role of government, I think different people will have different responses to that. I don't think what I have seen with participants that I've worked very closely with is that they want to see government in that first session come and say, your work is really important to us. We really appreciate this. This is important to us. We can't wait to see your proposals, and to sort of recognize their commitment and their work. And then they want to see them at the end receiving the final report. They do not want to see government hovering around in between. I think they feel manipulated. I think citizens are really smart. They're really committed to their work. They want to be able to be independent, and they don't want government around. Having said that, there are spaces where bringing government bodies and government leaders from different agencies is helpful, because in that situation, they can come and see the great work that citizens are doing. Then there is, as long as there's this opportunity to ask questions of each other, I think that can be a very healthy complement as well. And I think Nick mentioned this, but I will also just drop a pin on this. In Brussels, the city of Brussels, and one of my case studies in my book is the deliberative committee of the Brussels Parliament. They actually combine their elected representatives into the process. So every citizens assembly of the Brussels Parliament has about 30 some citizens involved on the issue, plus 16 members of parliament. And that is a fantastically interesting combination on a number of different fronts. But again, it has to be done really well. And those representatives need to understand that they are equal to the citizens, and they're not in that space to be elected representatives. And then I just want to mention that someone asked a really good question about the disruptive participants. And just to put all of your minds at ease, I think all of us worry about that. But someone said to me, and this advice I will share with you, was that any population, you're going to get 10% of crazies. You're going to get 10% of people who are there to disrupt. And it's really hard, but no matter what you do, you are going to have a small population of people who are there to disrupt. The great thing is that the rest of the citizens are really smart. And so the voice of the disruptors often, at least in my experience, becomes smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they're practically ignored.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Marjan said, as usual. I would just add on the disruption question. I've just working inside of government at a lot of different levels, have run or been to, as I'm sure many or all of you have, hundreds of town halls, and deliberative processes look really different. People interact inside them in a really different way because they are more thoughtful, because the expectations are different, the social norms around them are different. They just look and feel a lot different than what your typical town hall or an angry school board meeting and all of the things that we see in the news kind of blowing up. So I don't mean to say that there are no disruptive people who will show up to a citizen assembly. I think Marjan is right, but they do tend to look and feel different than a lot of what you're used to, especially at the municipal level. I would just touch, in addition to that, on the media element. So this is a huge opportunity to engage local media in places that are still fortunate enough to have some local media. And I know that that's not the case everywhere, but hugely important, certainly in terms of socializing what the assembly is. And I think answering all of these questions for the community. These are all really good questions. And I think if this feels like it's being airdropped on your community as this wonderful new innovation that the Europeans love, like that's not necessarily going to make you think this is the right thing for you. It could certainly just feel like one more thing that, the city's doing, and you'll maybe keep tabs on it and see how it goes. So I think that there's a lot of creative engagement that local media can do. In Millcreek, we're fortunate to have wonderful radio affiliates, wonderful local newspaper. So a lot of assets there. But as Marjan talked about, this is a hugely transparent process. So there are opportunities from beginning to end in every segment of this, for local media to be involved, to see what's going on, to report what's coming out of it, to talk not just to the assembly participants, but to people in the broader community as well. And I think that's part of the feedback loop that we've all been talking about.
And I'll just quickly add to what Marjan and Jillian shared, all of which I agree with, to say that both having a robust and multi-channel communications plan and working through relationships are key ingredients for the accountability that I think was at the heart of your question, Matt. So when I say multifaceted, I mean that we're working not just through media outlets, but we're using digital media. We're finding people online, as we have done with our chatbot. We're working through relationships and newsletters for different subgroups. And we're not creating a one-way communication. We're creating a feedback loop from the participants in the assembly to the broader community and back. And relationships are not only key to the high functioning of that communications plan, but also key to good behavior within the assemblies themselves. So we are really intentional about how we build and manage those relationships within the assembly in a facilitated process to prevent disruption.
Awesome, thank you. And we are running out of time here, but and there's a number of questions which are much more logistical, some of which are about the samples, how you construct them. Do you oversample for a particular affected population, that sort of thing? Questions about kind of what exactly do you put in the mailers and things like that to tell people, orient people about the process. Some about kind of how you actually structure those meetings you guys were talking about with elected officials and other. So there, I'm going to leave those, however, because there's a little bit more in the weeds. We're going to give you a whole bunch of materials. Some of the answers are there. We also want to give you an opportunity to actually interact with us, meaning Jillian, Marjan, Brandon, Nick, myself. So that's going to be part of a poll we're going to put up in a second. But let me kind of ask then a final question here, which is more about kind of the relationship between assemblies and other sorts of engagement. So some people asked that. Someone asked about PB, participatory budgeting in particular, and Nick put a comment on that. Somebody else asked about how do these connect with other things. What would you all say about that?
Yeah, I would say broadly, we don't think that citizen assemblies need to exist in a silo and probably shouldn't. I think they can be connected to other existing processes. You could imagine them being connected to ballot initiatives, for example. PB is a great example. I won't make myself say participatory, but I think that they are part of building the civic culture of the place where they are happening. So there's a ton of public and stakeholder engagement on the front end, and that needs to continue through the assembly and after the assembly. So as you institutionalize this and as you bring more and more people into this process, there are a lot of different ways that those people can be engaged, not just the citizen assembly. And I think we need to be thinking as much about the full community and how those people are engaged and mobilized in an ongoing way as we do about the 40 or so people who are actually in the assembly.
And that's why we embed them in a full civic engagement process. I think there's a danger to implementing citizens assemblies as isolated from other civic practices that might be going on or trying to go on in the community, which is that implementation becomes harder. And when recommendations are shelved, that decreases civic trust. So
Right.
Embedding the assembly within a holistic arc of engagement is incredibly important for building increasingly inclusive civic muscle over time and for their own effectiveness, in our view.
So I'll just add a little comment. So I think that, we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but still to this day, I think one of the gold standards of citizens assemblies is the Irish model. And that citizens assembly rested on, it was a citizens assembly that was combined with referendums, and it continues to be the case. And so it's a beautiful way to combine your assembly with the public. I will say, though, just a word of caution, I've given presentations on the ways to kind of connect the mini public, as we call it, the citizens assemblies, with the maxi public, the broader public. So I believe in the importance of that at every stage. I think at the beginning, in terms of public education, throughout, and then at the end as well. I will say, though, that we do have a lot of problems. I always say that there's a difference between the potential of Citizens Assembly and the practice of Citizens Assemblies. So I would also want to say that takes a lot of time. And I am worried sometimes when we distract from the assembly and try and now connect it with the public, are we lessening the impact of the assembly itself? So of course, if those mechanisms and the resources exist to do it all holistically, as Jillian and Brandon suggested, I think it's a beautiful idea, but I think practice and reality can be a little bit different. And let's make sure that as we're experimenting with Citizens Assembly, that they're also implemented really well.
Awesome. So to that end, please, we're going to put up a little poll here. Please tell us what additional information you would find most helpful about assemblies, and we will try to get back to you about some of those sorts of things. Also, they'll in a second here, once people have a chance to respond to this, we're going to put up a second question, which is basically, would you like to have a conversation with one of us about a particular issue? A couple people already put things like that into the chat, so we will certainly reach out to you if you give us your contact info or tell us that you'd like to know more or have a particular question that you think one of us can help you with. Okay, thank you all for joining us. This has been a terrific session. Thank you, Marjan and Jillian and Brandon, for sharing all of your wisdom with us. Please tune in, all of you, for we have these promising practices webinars every month, and sometimes more than once a month. We may well have more. We probably will have more on citizen assemblies themselves. So please kind of stay tuned for information about those. And here's the question with you: if you want to connect with any of the speakers, you just need to tell us who you'd like to connect with and your email address. So please do that. And thank you all for participating today.